just when the world has thought to have gained back hope from the pandemic. The repercussions of low interest rates and the unpredicted emergence of the Russian-Ukrainian war. Financial crisis driven by high prices, interest rates, and exchange rates, known as the three highs. The trade deficits and the chance of a currency crisis.
I think 2022 will be the worst in the last 2 decades.
인플레이션과 침체 간의 선택?
However,
2023 will be a difficult year for many, but a turning point will come eventually.
a turning point at a time of comprehensive crisis. How can Korea overcome its challenges?
지난 한 해는 그 코스트 푸시 인플레이션의 조짐을 많이 보여왔습니다. 그러다 보니까 전 세계적으로 미국 연준을 비롯해서 고금리 정책을 쓰지 않을 수가 없고 고금리 정책에 의해서 이런 통화 긴축으로 기업들도 많이 힘들고 그리고 소비도 많이 위축이 된 그런 어려운 상황이었습니다.
The government forecasts the economy will grow 1.6% in 2023. That's down 0.9% from the 2.5% growth forecast reported in June last year. The outlook for 2023 is the lowest growth forecast since the 97-98 Asian financial crisis.
전 세계 경제 상황이 좋지 않아지고 있기 때문에 가장 솔직하게 있는 그대로 객관적으로 국민들께 제시해 드리고자 해서 수치를 제시했다는 말씀을 드리고
The government predicted the economic recovery would slow amid comprehensive crises and added the risk of the three highs would continue with spiking prices, interest rates, and exchange rates.
경기가 둔화되는 단계로 이제 접어드는 상황이고 그리고 그동안 상당히 이 과열되었던 부동산 시장이 이제 상당히 냉각되는 시점이다라고 말씀드릴 수가 있겠습니다. 그리고 그동안 누적된 가계부채라든지 우리 경제의 소위 얘기하는 아킬레스건이라고 일컬어졌던 많은 문제들이 이제 본격적으로 위험해지는 실제 그 잠재적 위험이 가시화될 가능성이 생겨나기 시작을 하고 있다라고 말씀을 드릴 수가 있겠습니다.
In 2022, the war between Russia and Ukraine deteriorated the global economy that was recovering from the pandemic by disrupting the supply chains and adding pressure to cause inflation. The global grain prices that skyrocketed still remain at a steep value.
Year 2022, I think we cannot talk about it without mentioning Ukrainian war. And the Ukrainian war has brought serious problems of inflation, the lack of grains, and also it had inflicted very negative effects upon international investment and trade. So Ukrainian war was, I think, one of the most important happenings in 2022. Besides that, I think global economy has been plagued by global inflation.
As the Russian-Ukraine war shows no signs of a ceasefire, the world economy is sinking deeper into recession.
It's hard to know what's going to happen in Ukraine. It could go, could grow in a positive direction for the Ukrainians, or it could go in a negative direction. But beyond that, I would add, it's also a serious issue that the world is seeing higher inflation than we've seen for a long time.
A new history was written in the latter half of 2022. Unprecedented inflation resulted in unprecedented rate hikes.
작년에 4번의 75bp 인상은 아마 유사 이래 처음일 것 같고요. 그런 식으로 빨리 올린 적은 없었습니다. 과거에도 오랫동안 올린 적은 있습니다. 그렇지만 이번에 하는 75bp, 그러니까 50bp를 빅스텝, 75bp를 자이언트 스텝이라고 하는데요. 그런 것을 4번 연속한 거는 아마 유사일에 없었고 앞으로도 그런 일이 다시 일어나지 않기를 바랄 뿐입니다.
Korea has raised key rates 7 times in 2022. It's vital to understand that the rate hike isn't over yet.
And many people in Korea and the government believe that we cannot follow step by step, what the Federal Reserve will be doing. So we understand the Korean rate will be a little lower than the Federal Reserve. But how far will be the distance? I think 1% gap is acceptable, 1% gap. So I believe that Korean rate will be about 1% lower than American rate. So I think if we accept that, the next year Korean rate will be rising again. At least I think once or twice, baby step.
A 2023 economic report put together by OECD predicts the global economy will grow 2.2%, while Korea 1.8%. It lowered Korea's growth outlook twice.
First, global demand for Korean exports is weakening. Semiconductors is the most prominent example. This industry was a major growth engine pulling Korea out of the COVID crisis. But the cycle has turned and declining sales will weigh on export. The second is household consumption, as high inflation and increasing interest rates are eating away people's incomes and pouring a bucket of ice on the housing market. These trends will continue into 2023, and they will also weigh down business and housing investments.
While the consumer price is expected to grow over 3%, the uncertainty surrounding domestic and external contraction rates, the monetary policies of major countries, as well as currencies and oil prices, are high.
The Bank of Korea is doing a good job, and curbs to spending growth will help next year. But we think it will take time to reduce inflation and re-anchor inflation expectation. There are several reasons for this. First, energy price increases have only hit electricity consumers gradually, as prices have been increased with a lag, with huge losses having been absorbed by KEPCO. And this process takes time, and even though we think headline inflation has peaked, we only see it coming down gradually.
The continuing high inflation and the constantly rising interest rates resulted in slashing economic growth.
But to me, the real problem for 2023 will be slowing economy, especially, as I mentioned, people had lost about 1,000 trillion worth of wealth in stock prices and house prices. And because they feel about 1,000 trillion won poorer than 2022. So they will naturally reduce their consumption. And if they reduce the consumption, that means, the restaurants, the marts, all the, small businesses will be negatively affected.
In 2022, the Federal Reserve initiated rate hikes at the fastest pace since the 1980s. No one could have predicted the rate to make this leap from a year before.
낮은 금리가 계속될 것으로 생각하고 사람들이 금융행위를 했습니다. 가장 대표적인 분들이 소위 영끌족이라고 불리는 분들이죠. 그렇지만 예상과 달리 금리는 많이 올랐고요. 그러다 보니까 낮은 이자율에서 조금만 이자를 지불하면 될 거라고 생각했는데 훨씬 더 많은 이자를 지불하는 그러한 분들이 생기고, 그러다 보니까 많은 문제가 생기고 있습니다. 그런 분들은 소비를 많이 줄일 수밖에 없는 게 경제의 현실입니다.
실질 소득이 감소를 하게 되면 당연히 가계부채가 많은 가구들 같은 경우 부채 상환 능력이 떨어지고, 그럴 경우 그 위험이 다시 금융회사로 전이되고, 이런 이제 순환 고리를 만들어내겠죠. 부동산 가격이 조정되는 과정에서 이미 일부 시장에 표출되기는 했지만 금융시장이 불안정해질 가능성이 있다는 점.
In 2023, it is predicted that the three highs may also lead the U.S. economy into recession. And with the U.S. and China locking horns over hegemonic control, the global economy is shaping to be split into two. Rather than a bilateral rivalry, it is evolving into a competition among coalitions that side with either the U.S. or China.
Although, as I mentioned, that nowadays the situation is not as serious as the Cold War period, But we have if we look at the current situation, such concerns are becoming more true and more real because the countries are forced to choose sides between US and China. So I've seen, more countries have been brought into this US-China global competitions. I think that is a dangerous and a risky signal that we have to confront in the coming 2023.
The US, which used to be the biggest trading nation in the world, let China take its place in the 2010s. The bilateral rivalry started to emerge as Washington tried to keep Beijing in check from rising. Technological hegemony is at stake in the ongoing competition. The US is to protect it, while China insists on claiming it. As the economy makes a transition from analog to digital, the US-China trade war will continue as the winner will take the economic hegemony in various technological and industrial areas. The chip war between the US and China is also reaching new heights. The US has formed a coalition with the Netherlands and Japan to throttle China's chip development.
We've had those conversations with both Japan and the Netherlands and with other countries as well, and I'm not going to get ahead of any announcements. I will just say that we are very pleased with the candor, the substance, and the intensity of the discussions that are taking place across a broad range of countries who share our concerns and would like to see broad alignment as we go forward.
In return, China has hit back against the US chip curbs with a WTO complaint. China fears that the export controls would impact Japan and the Netherlands to restrict selling chip-making tools to China.
美国滥用出口管制措施，阻碍芯片等产品的正常国际贸易，将对全球半导体供应链造成扭曲，对国际贸易造成扰乱。
The Yoon administration is expanding its alliance with the US amid the ongoing US-China conflict. But in reality, the importance of diplomacy with China cannot be stressed enough.
Well, I think Korea is a great example of an economy that's caught in the middle. You have a lot of trade with both. You have more trade with China than you do with the US, but the US is an important economic partner and even more important strategic partner. So I think the tension between the US and China creates real problems for an economy like Korea.
With the resurgence of COVID-19, China imposed massive lockdowns, causing factories to shut down and wreaking havoc on supply chains. The strict antivirus and quarantine measures put brakes on recovery. The Chinese government emphasized doubling down on antivirus policies after the third term of President Xi Jinping began.
To me, more concerned about is what's happening in China, because China has been slowing down the economy no matter what is the reason, zero COVID policy, whatever. It is pretty evident that Chinese economy is just slowing down.
25% of Korean exports are shipped to China. The slowing Chinese growth has resulted in Korea logging a trade deficit with China. And as trade with China started crumbling, the entire trade balance has become unstable. But the Yoon administration is looking to decouple from China rather than strengthen cooperation.
하나는 여러분 아시다시피 중국이 성장이 둔화되고 그다음에 내수 중심의 전략으로 전환이 되고 있습니다. 그래서 지난 20년간 우리가 누려왔던 중국을 통한 수출 호황의 시대는 끝나가고 있습니다. 그래서 우리가 중국에 대한 시장이 필요하고 또 다변화가 필요한 그런 실정입니다.
And so far for the last 2 decades, Korean economy has been deeply associated with the Chinese economy. And when China economy, slowing down, it's going to have a very negative effect upon Korean economy. And on top of it, new government, Yoon Sung-hwan government, has a very different stance than previous government towards Chinese governments.
The Korea-China summit that took place on the sidelines of the G20 summit served as a stepping stone to normalizing bilateral relations. Optimism is cautiously rising as China lifted the ban on Korean entertainment content after 6 years. Sandwiched between the US and China, which path will Korea benefit from the most?
현재 우리나라의 경제의 위치에서 어느 것이 더 도움이 되는가, 그리고 중장기적으로 안보의 측면에서 어떤 것이 도움이 되는가 하는 것에 대한 그야말로 정부의 결정인데요. 그 결정을 잘하고 어떤 결정을 내리든지 간에 국민들에게 소통하고 국민들의 동의를, 가능한 많은 분들의 동의를 구해나가는 과정, 이게 가장 중심이 되어야 할 것은 틀림이 없습니다.
That is going to be the most challenging and most dramatic because so far, so many companies, so many enterprises have been deeply associated with China, right? And we have to cut it rather dramatically because of the global situation. I think that's going to have a tremendous effect upon Korean economy.
In 2023, the economic slowdown will be much more noticeable in the US and Europe. As the fight against inflation continues, the vast majority of consensus will be reshaped into admitting that there will be a recession. The global growth slowdown is expected to make a massive impact on the Korean economy.
전 세계 경기가 둔화되면서 수출이 상당히 수출 동력이 이제 약화될 가능성이 있고, 수출이 약화될 경우에 설비 투자나 이런 것들이 부진하고, 그게 결국엔 또 우리 경제의 성장 동력을 낮출 수가 있거든요. 그래서 그런 부분들이 위협 요인이 되지 않겠느냐, 그렇게 생각을 합니다.
It raises a major red flag for the Korean economy, which mainly relies on exports. In November 2022, the Trade Ministry and the Korea Customs Service reported that Korea is poised to log a trade deficit of nearly $50 billion. While some are skeptical that deteriorating exports will speed up the recession, there is a glimpse of silver linings.
But traditionally, one of the best policy to stimulate export is exchange rate. So in that sense, exchange rate has been rising very rapidly from 1,100 to almost 1,400. So I think that's a very a good sign for Korean export.
President Yoon has stressed the importance of implementing active export measures since the launch of his administration.
수출 드라이브와 우리 그 스타트업 코리아라는 이 두 개의 축으로서 우리 어려운 경제 여건을 좀 돌파해 나가기를 전 바랍니다.
Proactive steps have started being made to expand the nation's exports. The Foreign Ministry has launched a task force to provide a one-stop diplomatic support to expand local companies' exports and orders abroad. To ensure the stability of its exports, Korea must rely on investment and exports to find an economic breakthrough.
It's very important to maintain an extremely flexible exchange rate. So if the price of oil or food shoots up, and these are important imports for Korea, natural thing would be for your currency to depreciate, and that would tend to limit other imports by making them more expensive, keep space for energy and food, and increase your exports. So I'm a big believer in free trade, flexible exchange rates, especially for a medium-sized economy like South Korea.
The government is at a watershed in making a crucial decision. The world is polarized and confronted to the fullest on military security, and the financial and foreign exchange market is in a highly volatile state. The likelihood of currency crisis is building up within emerging countries, and the three highs in place, interest rates and exchange rates, have established the most hostile financial atmosphere.
올해 세계 경제는 그 어느 때보다 경기 침체 가능성이 큽니다. 세계 경기 침체의 여파가 우리 실물 경제의 둔화로 이어질 수 있는 엄중한 경제 상황을 면밀하게 점검해 나아가겠습니다. 물가 상승을 억제하기 위해 실시하는 불가피한 금리 인상의 조치가 우리 가계와 기업의 과도한 채무 부담으로 확대되지 않도록 선제적으로 관리해 나아가겠습니다.
Rather than easing the monetary policy and stimulating economic growth, the administration plans to speed up the recovery by increasing spending in the first half of the year. The nation plans to expand its trade financing for local exporters to a record 360 trillion won, or $276 billion by 2027. It also intends to become one of the top 4 arms exporters by fostering its arms industry as a national strategy and future growth engine. The government also added it would pursue a more concrete project that's more private-oriented and closer to the people's livelihoods instead of pushing for public-led projects driven to foster industries. Moreover, the government unveiled a roadmap for the tourism market's speedy recovery from the pandemic by expanding the budget for the tourism sector.
우리 경제의 회복력을 제고할 수 있도록 회복력과 관련된 분야에 대한 과감한 투자를 유도하는 것이 중요하고, 또한 우리 경제의 생산성 제고 그리고 지속 가능 발전을 위한 대통령께서도 말씀을 하셨듯이 여러 가지 개혁 과제가 있지 않겠습니까? 이런 개혁 과제를 과감히 추진하는 게 중요한 경제 정책의 한 축이 되어야 된다라고 생각을 합니다.
The government also plans to adjust its population crisis management measures as low birth rate and aging become major social issues. Low birth rate and aging will further destabilize the economy.
Korea is aging rapidly with an average of 0.8 children per woman. This means that an ever-declining number of workers must finance pension and healthcare for an increasing number of the elderly. And we can learn lessons from Japan. Japan's rapid population aging doubled public social spending between 1991 and 2015 as a percent of GDP. As a result, public debt soared from about 60% of GDP to nearly 250%. So fiscal discipline and efficiency of spending programs is important, and I think this is in line with the government's plans. Policies should also strive to increase employment among youth and women.
Economic entities must be safeguarded in the face of a crisis. To do so, the government policy must be flexible so it caters to specific economic situations.
정부에서 조금 더 명확하게 정책을 펴나가서 줄일 수 있는 불확성을 줄여나가는 것이 금융기관의 인사, 금융기관의 경영 혹은 금융상품 그런 모든 것들에 있어서 가장 중요한 정책이고, 올해도 코로나가 어떻게 변이할지는 모르겠으나 가능한 범위 내에서 크게 보면 저희 인간이 할 수 있는 일 중에 하나가 줄일 수 있는 불확성을 줄여주는 게 할 수 있는 가장 좋은 대책이 아닌가.
세계사를 돌아보면 위기와 도전이 세계 경제를 휘몰아칠 때 혁신을 통해 새로운 기술과 산업을 발굴한 나라가 양질의 일자리를 창출하고 지속 가능한 성장을 이룰 수 있었습니다. 국민 여러분과 함께 새로운 도약을 반드시 이루어내겠습니다.
2022 was full of uncertainties and complicated roadblocks due to the war in Russia and Ukraine. In 2023, a new risk may arise in the domestic and global supply chain. Because economic security is directly tied to people's livelihoods, the link between diplomacy and finance has never been more quintessential than now. And for Korea to make a higher leap, it must never cease to be more proactive with intensity and high spirit.